After watching Alabama Tennessee this weekend, I felt an obligation to talk about this game, especially, everybody's talked about the storylines with Nick Saban. Obviously, Jalen Milroe going into his junior year, the expectations are there. A new founded team with, Kalen DeBoer coming in and, a lot of his Washington transplants coming in, having Nick Sheridan being offensive coordinator for his first season and really being in the limelight of the SEC. And all things considered with this Alabama team, there's just been so many highs and lows for only being halfway into the season that I felt it was necessary to talk about them for a number of reasons. I think obviously with the new SEC and all of that, with Texas and Oklahoma coming in and all that, the competition is is significantly much more than it used to be. Obviously, with the divisions gone away, that makes it much more significant as well. And just to cap off, now that they lost to Tennessee, this is their first season since 2007, which was Nick Saban's first season at Alabama. First season with multiple losses since 2007. Currently ranked 15th in the AP poll, which is also the lowest that they've been since that time too. And looking at Alabama full circle now, going into the season, I'm not sure if anybody necessarily thought they were going to win the SEC championship. I mean, at least on this show, I mean, my prediction was that Georgia was going to win the SEC title and win for a third straight time. And obviously, too, Texas is a great team with a ton of talent, and they're great recruiters as well. And then obviously, I think with Alabama, you knew that there was going to be change, obviously, and that's already overstated, and we don't have to talk about that. But I think it was more or less like how much of a transition was it going to be for Alabama and Kalen DeBoer and all of those setups to get the ground running. But as we can all see with this season, I mean, there's definitely been a lot more hurdles than kind of expected. And when I think about this Alabama team, I go back and I was thinking about the Tennessee game, thought about the South Carolina game, I thought about the Wisconsin game before that, and also the Georgia game that they barely hung on to, and obviously they won that. But now that you look at this team and they're ranked 15th and they already have two losses on the season, I think there are a couple things that are noteworthy to talk about Alabama, and also in terms of how Alabama has to look for the rest of the season in order for them to maximize Kalen DeBoer's year one. But I think most importantly, one of the other quite noteworthy things to ask is how does Alabama need to change in order for them to make a significant run for the rest of the season? I'd say, first and foremost, just briefly talking about the Tennessee game before I get into the highs and lows. The one thing that I think that's being a little bit understated in terms of this Alabama Tennessee game is Alabama's defense showed, they played a lot better than I think, most people are giving them credit for. Now, granted, Nico isn't the best deep ball passer. He wasn't really able to get that going versus Alabama necessarily. But they made a solid amount of stops. They were able to get takeaways. Unfortunately, the offense really didn't have many chances to capitalize on that. Now there are a multitude of reasons why they weren't capitalizing on that. I think primarily just because I found a lot of their play to be sloppy and undisciplined, particularly in the offensive line, which I definitely found a little bit surprising too. I think this is a really fascinating stat to listen to here that I was looking at in preparation for this episode. But Alabama had 15 penalties this weekend against Tennessee, and the most they had in program history was back in 2022 in Knoxville when they had 17 penalties in total. So when you think about this Alabama team, I mean, even people who've watched Alabama, and feel free to comment and down below too to express what you think about this too. But the penalties were there even when they were playing South Carolina and some of the earlier games this year. Even when they had that early game versus South Florida too, it took them really until the second, third quarter to really get going too, in order for them to really piece it together too. And it was just those mental errors that, ultimately were the catalyst for Tennessee being able to, kind of pull away with it too. And, you know, when you're thinking about this too, I mean, obviously the offense is primarily built around Jalen Milroe. We all understand that he's a great running threat. He's progressed significantly throughout his tenure as Alabama starter. He really had a great season last year, and I think the expectations were you know pretty significant, all things considered. I mean, he really is the ultimate package in a lot of ways, but you know one of the things you have to ask yourself if you're this Alabama offensive staff is how are we going to reduce the the turnovers that we're seeing in the end in the red zone and etc. Because you ask yourself too, he has all the tools necessary to get there, but it just seems like you know when Ryan Williams isn't necessarily there. I mean, they have a bunch of great playmakers too, but it seems like either they're automatically always going to him, or Milroe's just trying too hard to make plays happen when they're not there. You know, I think one of the things that have found the most frustrating about watching Alabama this season is they go into the first half, they play complimentary football, and then once they go into the second half, it's as if the running game doesn't even matter anymore. I mean, when you have a guy like Jam Miller who can fight for those extra yards and could be a really great resource for you in those critical third down situations, why not get him more involved? I mean, in my opinion, when you see Jalen Milroe making 50 attempts a game for the past couple weeks, it's just in it's to me it's unsustainable for them to expect him to do that. And there were definitely times where this offensive line was able to get a decent push and get that going too. But when you're passing so many times a game, when you're playing at a place like Neyland Stadium, which is a really hostile environment in the SEC, and on top of that, you've already seen a lot of times too where they're getting in good field position, whether it be an interception or a fumble recovery or whatever, and then you have these mental errors too, such as when you had, for example, the opening drive fumble where the Alabama center had a false start and you make it a second and long, and then they have to punt the ball. It's just those mental errors that are adding up that ultimately become one of the big reasons why Tennessee was able to pull this off too. Especially a really vulnerable Tennessee team, I might add, who who lost the week before to Arkansas, to a really good Arkansas team that, although got their ass whooped by LSU, nevertheless still really a tough place to play and a much more talented team than I think a lot of people are giving them credit for. But now that we discussed the Tennessee game briefly, think what next step should be in this conversation is how what exactly Alabama needs to do and how do I think they're going to do it. Goes without saying that Alabama pretty much has to go undefeated at this point. I can't find a way where they would go 9-3 and still be able to make the playoff. Now, granted, Vanderbilt is somehow ranked 25th right now, and they have two losses, which, in my opinion, I don't think they should be ranked when you have teams like Syracuse and UNLV, who I would argue have had a better season than them, but somehow Vanderbilt is still ranked, or hell, even Michigan, even Michigan's ranked still, and they already have two losses. But back to this. So when you think about this Alabama team, obviously they have to win out. Starts with Mizzou this weekend. They Mizzou has kind of had a really you know an up and down season. It's been, I think it's been a roller coaster in a couple ways, because I think Mizzou is one of those teams where you you want to find yourself thinking that they're going to make the next step, the next progression, but for every time you make that step or that next progression, you you know that they're going to lose that big game. I feel like Mizzou in some ways kind of reminds me of Penn State, in the sense of, like, yes, they have that expectation of being in the top 20, but does anybody really think that they're threatening for a national title? Not yet. Hopefully it's different for Penn State this year, but you get the general gist of what I'm getting at. But it starts the Mizzou this weekend, who, quite frankly, I think looked really vulnerable against Vanderbilt. They they looked really vulnerable against Vanderbilt. They barely squeaked by versus Auburn this weekend, who, you know, by the way, they also had Brady Cook, who wasn't there for the majority of the game, and Drew Pine was clearly struggling and just simply wasn't really getting enough plays for them to really kind of run away with it. Because I think, all things considered, a lot of people thought that, yes, Auburn could possibly pull off the upset too, but at the same time too, I think what's missing with this Missouri offense is they don't have. I think not having Cody Schrader anymore puts a lot more pressure on Brady Cook, and in turn, although Missouri does have a lot of offensive weapons, particularly a really good wide receiving core, there's still going to be a bunch of defenses that know, now that he has this foot injury, that are going to start pressuring him. They're going to start pressuring Brady Cook a lot more. So obviously, it starts off with that, and they have to win there. So we'll see what happens. But, based on the Mizzou that we've seen the past couple weeks, I wouldn't be I would be shocked if they didn't win that game. So, assuming that they beat Mizzou, they go on idle. And here, I think, to me, this is really where the season is going to be defined for Alabama, going on the road against LSU in Death Valley at Baton Rouge. And I'm going to be doing a segment in probably a day or two, in terms of talking about LSU a little bit further. But, there's definitely going to be some talk with them, in terms of them being a legitimate CFP contender, and possibly even an SEC title, depending on, how, depending on how Georgia, Texas, and Alabama all turn out. Hell, if it ended today, it would be Texas A&M versus LSU in the SEC championship game, because they're both undefeated in conference play. So it goes to show that, right now it's really unpredictable, but that's also one of the fun aspects of having the SEC right now, is having having more competition, more players there. And, assuming, if you do have that partnership with the Big Ten, maybe they do decide to have a, more conference play as well, and possibly expanding that relationship with the Big Ten. So if you ask me, that's going to be the game that really defines their season. And then you have your tune-up game versus a really strong FCS program in Mercer. Then you go on the road to Oklahoma, who's clearly struggled. They just fired their first year coordinator, Seth Lintrell, who was head coach at North Texas for a while, and has had a couple offensive coordinator stints at a number of a number of Power Four programs. And then you finish the year at Tuscaloosa in the Iron Bowl. So yeah, so back to what I was saying too. It's The reality is, if they lose the LSU game, which, if I was betting my bottom dollar now, they probably will, that leaves them at 9-3. And is 9-3 a disappointment with the roster that you have? Absolutely. But you do have a couple positives. You do have a foundational you do have some foundational offensive weapons, i.e. Ryan Williams, who has been a ton of fun to watch, a really mature kid, handles himself well, and he's playing some of the toughest corners in all of college football and all of the SEC, and he's still holding his own. So I'm really excited to see what you see out of him moving forward. And then I think the better question, I think, moving on from that too, is, assuming you let's even say you win out. Let's say somehow you even win out and you go 10-2. I think these are the possible couple things that we have to see in order for Alabama to win out right now. First and foremost, Jalen Milroe simply has to play better. Offensively, 2023, 65% completion percentage, 2,800 yards, 23 touchdowns, 6 interceptions, which right now he is matching his interception total to last year. Right now he has 13 touchdowns, six interceptions, 1,772 yards, and 68% completion percentage. If we want to see this Alabama team go undefeated the rest of the season, I think it starts on the offense side of the ball with Milroe just being a little bit more careful with the ball. I think, granted, the offensive line perhaps has not helped him out as much, particularly with some of the penalties that we've seen. Getting a little bit more pressure than you would like, losing in the trenches certainly isn't helping. But also, you got to find a way to get the running game going more. To me, it's just inexcusable that we're seeing more. I feel like we're seeing more and more of this college football now, of more teams going and just straight up just passing every single play. Whereas there's a ton of examples in college football where complementary football does legitimately work. I mean, you can look at, for example, the Florida game this past weekend where they played Kentucky and Florida ran the ball almost 35, 40 times. Whereas before Billy Napier, he was primarily calling pass plays 60% of the time. So it goes to show when you capitalize on the takeaways that you have, and you play complementary football, and you let your quarterback get comfortable. I think some things can definitely open up for him, especially when you're playing a team against Mizzou, who, all things considered, I mean, you just have to find a little bit more of that balance too. And I think most importantly, finding a way to get Jam Miller involved again and let Jalen Milroe use his feet, dude. I mean, I don't think we're seeing enough of Jalen Milroe. You know, getting some zone reads, maybe some quick plays. Just something like that to just get the ball rolling. And lastly, if you can get this Alabama defense to play just consistently as they did versus Tennessee, I would definitely be excited to see what happens next. But I think moving forward, you have to ask yourself, this Alabama defensive line has to keep playing pretty strong. You're definitely gonna have to ask a lot out of your secondary these next couple weeks when you have LSU and Mizzou coming up. And then also, I'm fascinated to see what kind of offense adjustments we're going to see from Alabama as time rolls along. I mean, if you can get this running game going just as much as you had last year, and get Jalen Milroe feeling more comfortable, is it possible that they can run the table? Sure, but right now, as it stands, I see themselves winning all their rest of the games this year, except LSU, slightly missing the SEC championship and the playoff, and hopefully building off of more than what we saw last year. But